The mill wheel at Harrow's Creek had stopped turning 3 days before anyone noticed the silence. In the autumn of 1864, when the war had drained the countryside of able-bodied men and left only the old, the infirm, and the fearful to tend the scattered farms of western Pennsylvania, such oversights had become disturbingly common. But Ezekiel Harrow's grist mill had ground corn and wheat for 47 years without pause, and its sudden stillness cast an unnatural quiet over the valley that made even the ravens avoid their usual roosts in the bare oak trees. Martha Caldwell discovered the trouble when she brought her weekly sack of grain to be ground. The miller's cottage sat dark and cold beside the motionless wheel, its windows reflecting the gray October sky like dead eyes. The creek continued to flow beneath the wooden mechanism, but the rushing water that should have turned the great wheel now passed uselessly beneath, carrying with it the first fallen leaves of the season, and something else that Martha would later try to forget. A scent like flowers left too long in standing water. The door to Harrow's cottage stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness within. Martha called out, her voice echoing strangely off the stone walls of the mill building, but received no answer except the hollow sound of water moving over rocks. She pushed the door wider and stepped inside, her boots clicking against the wooden floor with sounds that seemed too loud in the oppressive stillness. Have you ever encountered places that felt wrong somehow, where silence itself seemed threatening? Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and share your own experiences with locations that made your skin crawl for no apparent reason. Ezekiel Harrow sat in his chair beside the cold fireplace, his eyes open and staring at something Martha could not see. His face had taken on the waxy pallor of death, but his expression held none of the peace that usually accompanied a natural passing. Instead, his features were frozen in an attitude of profound terror, his mouth slightly open as if he had been trying to speak when his final moment arrived. His hands gripped the arms of his chair with such force that his knuckles had gone white, and Martha noticed with growing unease that his clothes were soaked through as if he had been caught in a downpour, though the weather had been dry for days. More disturbing than Harrow's obvious death was the condition of his cottage. Every surface in the room was covered with a thin film of moisture that caught the weak daylight and made everything gleam with an unhealthy wetness. The floorboards beneath Martha's feet felt spongy and unstable, as if the wood had begun to rot from within. When she reached out to touch the wall for support, her fingers came away damp and cold, and she realized that the moisture was not merely condensation, but something thicker, more substantial, water that seemed to cling to surfaces with deliberate intent. The mill wheel's silence meant more to the scattered residents of Harrow Valley than simple inconvenience. The grist mill served as a gathering place where neighbors exchanged news, shared concerns, and maintained the fragile connections that held their isolated community together. Without Harrow's steady presence and the comforting sound of his wheel turning grain into flour, the valley felt abandoned, cut off from the normal rhythms of life that had sustained its people through decades of hardship and uncertainty. Word of Harrow's death spread quickly through the valley, carried by the few travelers who still ventured along the muddy roads that connected the scattered homesteads. But with each telling, the story grew stranger and more troubling. Those who viewed the miller's body reported details that Martha had been too shocked to notice initially. The fact that Harrow's skin had taken on a bluish tinge characteristic of drowning victims, despite being found in his dry cottage. The discovery of pond weeds tangled in his hair, though the nearest standing water was half a mile away. And most unsettling of all, the small puddles of creek water that had apparently seeped up through the floorboards around his chair, as if the earth itself were weeping. Dr. Samuel Morrison, summoned from the county seat to examine the body, found himself unable to determine a cause of death that satisfied either medical science or common sense. Harrow's lungs contained water, suggesting drowning, but there was no possible way he could have drowned in his own cottage. His heart showed no signs of the deterioration that might indicate natural failure, and there were no wounds or other evidence of violence. Most puzzling was the temperature of the corpse. Despite having been dead for at least 3 days, Harrow's body remained unnaturally cold, as if it had been preserved in ice rather than exposed to the autumn air. "I've seen drowning victims pulled from winter rivers that weren't this cold," Dr. Morrison confided to Pastor Williams after completing his examination. "And there's something else. His eyes. Look at them closely and tell me what you see reflected there." Pastor Williams leaned over the corpse with considerable reluctance. Harrow's eyes, still open despite his death, held a quality that made the minister's skin crawl. In their glassy depths, Williams could swear he saw movement, not the random play of light and shadow, but something deliberate and purposeful, as if whatever had killed the miller was still present, watching from behind the dead man's gaze. "Water," Pastor Williams whispered, stepping back from the body. "I see water moving in his eyes. Dark water, like the bottom of a deep pond." Dr. Morrison nodded grimly. "And sometimes, if you look long enough, you can see something moving in that water. Something that shouldn't be there." The burial of Ezekiel Harrow took place on a gray morning when low clouds pressed down on the valley like a suffocating blanket. The small cemetery beside Pastor Williams's church sat on a hillside overlooking Harrow's Creek, and as the mourners gathered around the freshly dug grave, many noticed that the sound of running water seemed unusually loud, as if the creek had swollen overnight despite the absence of rain. The handful of valley residents who attended the service stood uneasily in the damp grass, their eyes darting frequently toward the tree line where shadows seemed to shift and move without explanation. Pastor Williams had prepared a simple service appropriate for a man of Harrow's steady character and long residence in the valley. But as he began to speak the familiar words of comfort and hope, his voice faltered and died. Standing at the edge of the small gathering just beyond the weathered headstones of earlier burials was a figure that made every person present question their own eyesight. A young girl, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, watched the proceedings with solemn attention. Her dress had once been white, but it was now stained with dark patches that looked exactly like water damage, the kind of discoloration that occurs when fabric remains wet for days or weeks. The stains spread across the cloth in irregular patterns that resembled maps of unknown countries, and they seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles, as if the water that had caused them was still moving within the fabric. The girl's hair hung in damp strands around her pale face, and droplets of water fell steadily from the ends to pool at her feet. But most disturbing was her expression, a look of patient waiting that suggested she had been standing in that spot for a very long time, watching and listening to things that the living could neither see nor hear. Her eyes held the same dark quality that Dr. Morrison had noticed in Harrow's corpse, as if they contained depths that had nothing to do with human sight. None of the mourners recognized the child. In a community as small and isolated as Harrow Valley, every resident was known to every other, and the appearance of a stranger, especially a child traveling alone, should have occasioned immediate concern and questions about her origins and purpose. But something about the girl discouraged approach or inquiry. She radiated a coldness that went beyond temperature, a sense of otherness that made the assembled mourners instinctively avoid looking directly at her, while remaining acutely aware of her presence. Pastor Williams attempted to continue the burial service, but his words came out as stammers and half-completed phrases. The familiar prayers that had comforted him through countless similar occasions now seemed inadequate and hollow, as if the presence of the girl had drained them of meaning and power. When he raised his eyes to look at her again, hoping to find that she had been merely a trick of light and shadow, he discovered that she had moved closer to the grave without appearing to take any steps. The girl now stood directly across from the pastor, with Harrow's open grave between them. Water dripped from her dress with audible patters onto the mound of excavated earth, and where the drops fell, the soil darkened and began to give off the same fetid smell that Martha Caldwell had noticed at the mill. The child's lips moved silently, as if she were reciting words in a language that had no sound, and Pastor Williams felt a growing certainty that she was conducting her own ceremony. one that had nothing to do with Christian burial or the comfort of the living. As the pastor struggled to complete the service, the girl raised one pale hand and pointed directly at the mourners. Her finger moved slowly from person to person, as if she were counting or making selections, and each individual she indicated felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the October air. When her gesture reached Martha Caldwell, the woman who had discovered Harrow's body, Martha gasped and took a step backward, nearly losing her balance among the weathered headstones. "She's wet," Martha whispered, though everyone present could see the water dripping from the girl's hair and clothing. "She's soaking wet, but she's not shivering. How can she be that wet without being cold?" Before anyone could respond to Martha's question, the girl opened her mouth and began to speak. But the voice that emerged was not that of a child. It was the sound of water moving through hollow spaces, of streams flowing through underground caverns, of rain falling into deep wells. The words, if they were words, carried meanings that bypassed rational comprehension and spoke directly to the primitive parts of the brain that recognized danger and death. The mourners fled. There was no shame in it, no embarrassment about abandoning dignity and decorum in the face of something that violated every natural law they understood. They ran through the cemetery and down the hillside toward their scattered homes, leaving Pastor Williams standing alone beside the open grave with the girl in the water-stained dress watching him with eyes like dark pools. The pastor remained at his post because duty demanded it, because he had committed his life to facing whatever spiritual challenges his calling might present. But as the girl began to move around the grave toward him, her feet making no sound on the grass despite the water that dripped constantly from her clothing, Williams felt his faith wavering for the first time in 30 years of ministry. This was not a test of religious conviction or an opportunity for pastoral guidance. This was something that existed outside the boundaries of his theological understanding. "Who are you, child?" Pastor Williams managed to ask, though his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The girl stopped walking but continued to watch him with that patient, waiting expression. When she spoke again, her voice retained its liquid quality, but the words became comprehensible, though no less unsettling for their clarity. "I am the girl who went into the water," she said. "I am the one who stayed when the others came back up. I am what remains when the current takes everything else away." Pastor Williams tried to formulate a response that would address both his pastoral duties and his growing terror, but before he could speak, the girl continued. "He saw me first," she said, gesturing toward Harrow's grave. "Saw me in the mill wheel's reflection when the water was just right. He tried to help, tried to pull me out, but you cannot pull someone back who is already drowned. You can only join them in the deep places where the water never stops moving." The implication of her words sent a chill through Pastor Williams that had nothing to do with the October air. If Harrow had died trying to rescue someone from drowning, it would explain the water in his lungs and the condition of his body, but it raised far more disturbing questions about the nature of the girl standing before him and the circumstances that had led to her presence in the valley. "When did you drown, child?" the pastor asked, though he was not certain he wanted to know the answer. The girl tilted her head as if considering the question from multiple angles. Water continued to drip from her hair, but the puddle at her feet never seemed to grow larger, as if the earth beneath her was absorbing the moisture as quickly as it fell. "Time moves differently in the water," she said finally. "Days and years and seasons all flow together like streams joining a river. I have been drowning for a very long time, and I will continue drowning until someone else takes my place." The pastor's theological training provided no framework for dealing with such statements. The girl's words suggested a trapped soul, perhaps someone who had died without proper spiritual preparation and now wandered in a state between life and death. But there was something in her manner that spoke of purpose rather than confusion, of deliberate action rather than aimless haunting. "What do you want?" Pastor Williams asked, though part of him feared that he already knew the answer. The girl smiled for the first time. and the expression transformed her face from merely unsettling to genuinely terrifying. Her teeth were white as polished bone, and water flowed between them as she spoke, as if her mouth were connected to some underground spring. "I want to go home," she said. "But the water is so deep, and I cannot swim alone. I need someone to help me find the bottom, someone to hold my hand while we go down together into the dark places where the current stops." With these words, the girl began to walk toward Pastor Williams, her bare feet leaving wet prints in the grass that steamed slightly in the cool air. The pastor wanted to run, every instinct screaming at him to flee from this impossible child who spoke of drowning as if it were a destination rather than a death. But his legs felt heavy and unresponsive, as if he were already standing waist-deep in water that resisted his movements. The girl reached out with one pale hand, and Pastor Williams could see that her fingers were wrinkled and softened as if they had been submerged for weeks. When she touched his wrist, her skin was so cold that it burned, and he felt moisture seeping through his clothing as if he were being gradually submerged in invisible water. "Come with me to the creek," the girl whispered, her voice now barely audible above the sound of water that seemed to be flowing through Williams's own ears. "Come and see how beautiful it is beneath the surface where the light filters down through the water like green fire, and the current carries away all the pain of living." Pastor Williams found himself walking toward the creek, though he could not remember deciding to move. The girl's hand on his wrist was like an anchor, pulling him inexorably toward the water that rushed past the base of the hillside cemetery. With each step, he felt his clothing growing heavier and more waterlogged, as if he were already partially submerged in the girl's otherworldly element. But as they reached the edge of the creek bank, Pastor Williams heard voices calling his name from the direction of the church. A group of his parishioners, led by Martha Caldwell, was approaching with lanterns and expressions of concern. They had noticed his prolonged absence from the burial and come to investigate, fearing that something might have happened to their minister in the aftermath of the strange events at Harrow's grave. The sound of familiar voices seemed to break whatever spell the girl had cast over Pastor Williams. He jerked his hand free from her grasp and stumbled backward, gasping as if he had been holding his breath underwater. When he looked around for the child, she had vanished, leaving only wet footprints that led to the edge of the creek and then disappeared into the flowing water. The parishioners found Pastor Williams standing alone beside the stream, his clothes completely dry, but his face bearing an expression of such profound terror that none of them dared ask what had occurred. Martha Caldwell noticed immediately that the temperature around the minister seemed several degrees colder than the surrounding air, and that his breath was visible as vapor despite the relatively mild evening. "Pastor," Martha said gently, "we've been calling for you. We saw you leave the cemetery, but then you seemed to disappear. Are you all right?" Pastor Williams looked at the concerned faces of his congregation and realized that he could not possibly explain what had just happened to him. The encounter with the girl in the water-stained dress belonged to a realm of experience that lay far outside normal human understanding, and any attempt to describe it would likely result in serious questions about his mental stability and fitness for pastoral duties. "I was praying by the creek," he said finally, which was not entirely untrue. Sometimes grief requires solitude to be properly processed. But Pastor Williams knew that his encounter with the drowned girl was far from over. As his parishioners escorted him back to the church, he could feel her presence following at a distance, and when he glanced back toward the creek, he saw a pale figure standing knee-deep in the flowing water, watching their departure with patient attention. The weeks following Harrow's burial brought an unseasonable coldness to the valley that seemed to seep into bones and linger there like a persistent chill. Residents began reporting problems with their wells, water that tasted of decay and pond scum, springs that ran muddy despite the absence of storms, and livestock that refused to drink from sources they had used without incident for years. The creek itself remained clear and fast-flowing, but those who lived nearest to its banks spoke of hearing voices in the water during the night hours, soft calls that seemed to beckon listeners toward the stream. Children in the valley began experiencing similar nightmares. dreams of drowning that left them gasping and soaked with perspiration, visions of a pale girl who stood at their bedroom windows and gestured for them to come outside and play in the water. Parents found their youngsters sleepwalking toward the creek with alarming frequency, and several families relocated their children to rooms on the sides of their houses that faced away from the water. Martha Caldwell's 8-year-old daughter, Susan, provided the most detailed account of these nocturnal visitations. According to the child, the girl in the water-stained dress appeared at her window every night just after midnight, tapping on the glass with fingers that left wet smudges. She never spoke, but her presence carried a compelling invitation that Susan found increasingly difficult to resist. "She wants me to come swimming with her," Susan told her mother, with the matter-of-fact tone that children use for the most extraordinary statements. "She says the water is warm once you get used to it, and that swimming at night is much better than swimming during the day because you can see the stars from underwater." Martha forbade Susan from approaching any windows after dark and moved the child's bed to the center of her room, far from any outside walls. But even these precautions could not prevent Susan from continuing to dream about the drowned girl, and Martha began to notice that her daughter's behavior was changing in subtle but disturbing ways. Susan had always been afraid of water, requiring considerable coaxing to take even the weekly baths that Martha considered necessary for proper hygiene. But now the child seemed drawn to every stream, pond, and puddle they encountered, and Martha frequently caught her standing at the edge of Harrow's Creek with a dreamy expression that suggested she was listening to something only she could hear. "The water is calling," Susan explained when questioned about this new fascination. "It wants to show me things. Beautiful things that live at the bottom where it's always quiet and peaceful. The girl says I would like it there, that I wouldn't have to worry about anything ever again." Martha's attempts to discuss these experiences with Pastor Williams met with limited success. The minister listened to her concerns with obvious discomfort, offering prayers and suggestions for spiritual protection that seemed inadequate to address the supernatural nature of the threat. Martha noticed that Pastor Williams avoided walking near the creek whenever possible, and that he had developed a nervous habit of checking locks and windows multiple times each evening. The truth was that Pastor Williams had been experiencing his own encounters with the girl in the water-stained dress. She appeared at his church during evening services, standing in the back pew with water pooling at her feet and her dark eyes fixed on his face with unnerving intensity. When he tried to approach her after the congregation had departed, she would vanish, leaving only the smell of stagnant water and wet footprints that led toward the creek. More disturbing were the changes that Pastor Williams noticed in his church building itself. The walls showed signs of moisture damage that appeared overnight, dark stains that resembled the patterns on the girl's dress. The wooden floors had developed a spongy quality that made walking feel unstable, and several floorboards had begun to warp as if they were absorbing water from some hidden source. When Williams brought in workmen to investigate, they found no evidence of leaks or structural problems that could account for the mysterious dampness. The first disappearance occurred in early November, when young Timothy Henderson failed to return from his evening chores. The 12-year-old boy had been sent to fetch water from the spring that supplied his family's farm, a routine task he had performed countless times without incident. When he did not return by nightfall, his parents organized a search that continued through the night and into the following day. They found Timothy's water bucket at the edge of the creek, half filled with murky liquid that bore no resemblance to the clear spring water he had been sent to collect. His footprints led to the bank and then simply stopped, as if he had walked into the stream and vanished beneath the surface. But despite dragging the creek with nets and poles, the searchers found no trace of the boy's body. What they did discover was far more unsettling than a simple drowning. Timothy's clothes were found neatly folded on a flat rock beside the creek, completely dry and arranged with a care that suggested deliberate placement rather than hasty removal. Beside the clothing was a collection of smooth stones arranged in a pattern that resembled a child's game, and scratched into the dirt nearby were words written in Timothy's distinctive handwriting. "Gone swimming with the girl. Water is warm. Don't worry." The boy's disappearance sent waves of fear through the valley that transformed the normal cautions of rural life into something approaching panic. Parents refused to allow their children outdoors after sunset, and even adults avoided traveling alone near any source of water. The creek that had once provided refreshment and power for the community's mill now seemed like a malevolent presence, flowing through the heart of their settlements with a sound that resembled whispered threats. Dr. Morrison, summoned once again from the county seat, examined the evidence of Timothy's disappearance with growing bewilderment. The arrangement of the boy's clothing and the message scratched in the dirt suggested a voluntary departure rather than an accident or abduction. But the idea that a 12-year-old child would willingly enter a creek in November, when the water temperature would cause rapid hypothermia, defied all reasonable explanation. Children don't simply decide to go swimming in weather like this, Dr. Morrison told Timothy's distraught parents. There must be some other explanation. Perhaps the boy was confused or frightened by something, or influenced by forces beyond our current understanding. The doctor's reluctance to voice his growing suspicions about supernatural involvement reflected the same struggle that affected everyone in Harrow Valley. The rational, scientific worldview that governed their daily lives provided no framework for understanding events that seemed to violate fundamental laws of nature and human behavior. Yet the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Something was drawing people to the water, something that could convince them to enter the creek willingly despite the obvious dangers. Pastor Williams found himself in an impossible position as the spiritual leader of a community, confronting phenomena that challenged every aspect of his theological training. His sermons became increasingly focused on protection from evil influences and the importance of avoiding temptation, but he could see in his congregation's faces that they recognized the inadequacy of conventional religious responses to their current situation. The minister's private struggles with the girl in the water-stained dress had intensified following Timothy's disappearance. She now appeared to him almost nightly, standing in his bedroom or sitting in his study with that patient expression that suggested she was waiting for him to make a decision he had not yet recognized as necessary. Her presence filled his house with the sound of dripping water and the smell of stagnant ponds, and Pastor Williams began to understand that she was not merely haunting the valley. She was actively recruiting companions for some purpose that lay beyond his comprehension. "You cannot save them by avoiding me," the girl told him during one of these midnight visitations. "You cannot protect them by pretending I am not here. I am the water that calls, and water always finds its way to the sea. Your Timothy understands this now. He is learning to breathe beneath the surface, learning to see the beauty that exists in the deep places where the current carries away all fear and pain." Pastor Williams tried to respond with prayers and biblical quotations, but the girl's presence seemed to drain his words of power and meaning. She listened to his religious formulations with the polite attention of someone humoring a child's game, then continued speaking as if he had not interrupted. "I am not evil," she said, her voice carrying the sound of water flowing over stone. "I am simply what remains when everything else has been washed away. I offer peace, Pastor Williams. I offer an end to struggle and worry and the constant fear of loss that defines your kind of existence. In the water, there is only the eternal present moment, only the gentle pressure that holds you safe from all the sharp edges of living." The girl's arguments contained a seductive logic that Pastor Williams found increasingly difficult to resist. The burdens of pastoral care, the constant exposure to human suffering and spiritual crisis, the weight of responsibility for his congregation's well-being. All of these pressures seemed insignificant compared to the peace that the girl promised in her underwater realm. But each time Pastor Williams felt himself wavering toward acceptance of her invitation, he remembered the faces of his parishioners, particularly the children who looked to him for protection and guidance. His duty to them provided an anchor that prevented him from drifting completely into the girl's otherworldly current, though he could feel that anchor growing weaker with each passing night. The second disappearance occurred just before Thanksgiving, when elderly Mrs. Abernathy vanished from her cottage during a night of heavy rain. The 73-year-old woman had been in poor health for months, barely able to walk without assistance, making her overnight absence particularly mystifying. Her family found the front door standing open, and Mrs. Abernathy's walking stick abandoned on the threshold, but no footprints or other signs indicated the direction of her departure. The storm had swollen Harrow's Creek to twice its normal size, and the searchers initially assumed that Mrs. Abernathy had become confused and fallen into the rushing water. But when the rain stopped and the creek returned to its normal level, they made discoveries that challenged this reasonable explanation. Mrs. Abernathy's body was found sitting peacefully on a submerged log in the middle of the creek, her clothes completely dry despite being surrounded by flowing water. Her face held an expression of serene contentment that contrasted sharply with her usual demeanor of pain and complaint. Most disturbing was the fact that she appeared to be younger than her chronological age. Her wrinkled skin had become smooth and pale, and her gray hair had darkened to the brown shade of her youth. Dr. Morrison's examination revealed that Mrs. Abernathy had drowned, but her lungs contained clear water rather than the muddy creek water that should have been present if she had fallen in during the storm. Her body temperature was so low that it should have caused immediate cardiac arrest, yet her heart showed no signs of distress. Most puzzling was the discovery that her clothing remained completely dry, even after being removed from the water, as if it possessed some property that repelled moisture. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Morrison confided to Pastor Williams after completing his examination. "She drowned in clear water while surrounded by muddy creek water. Her body shows signs of prolonged immersion, but her clothes are bone dry. And there's something else, her expression. I've seen a lot of drowning victims, Pastor, and they don't look peaceful like this. They look terrified, desperate. But Mrs. Abernathy looks like she died in her sleep, dreaming pleasant dreams." The pattern of mysterious deaths and disappearances continued throughout the winter, claiming victims with a regularity that transformed daily life in Harrow Valley into a careful dance of avoidance and precaution. Families moved their dwellings away from the creek when possible, and those who could not relocate hung iron horseshoes and scattered salt around their property in desperate attempts to ward off whatever force was claiming their neighbors. But these protective measures proved largely ineffective against an entity that could appear anywhere water was present. The girl in the water-stained dress manifested in rain barrels, washing basins, and even cups of drinking water, her pale face rippling beneath the surface as she beckoned to those who looked too closely. Children reported seeing her reflection in mirrors when their mothers washed their faces, and adults found her image appearing in windows streaked with condensation. Pastor Williams documented these encounters in a private journal that he kept hidden from his congregation, recording details that painted a picture of systematic haunting designed to gradually erode the community's resistance to the supernatural. The girl seemed particularly drawn to those who were suffering, the sick, the elderly, the grief-stricken, offering them relief from their pain through an invitation to join her in the peaceful depths where earthly troubles could no longer reach them. "She is harvesting souls," Pastor Williams wrote in his journal, "not through violence or coercion, but through temptation perfectly calibrated to each individual's deepest needs and desires. She offers Timothy adventure and freedom from adult supervision. She promises Mrs. Abernathy an end to physical pain and the restoration of youth. To me, she offers rest from the burden of caring for others and the peace of surrender to forces greater than human will." The minister's analysis was interrupted by a soft tapping at his study window. Pastor Williams looked up to see the girl in the water-stained dress standing outside, her pale hand pressed against the glass. Water streamed down the window around her fingers, though the night was clear and dry. "You understand now," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the glass. "You see what I offer and why they choose to come with me. The water is not cruel, Pastor Williams. The water is kind. It accepts everyone equally and asks nothing in return except the willingness to let go of the illusions that make living so difficult." Pastor Williams rose from his desk and approached the window, drawn despite his better judgment by the girl's patient presence. Up close, he could see that her water-stained dress was actually quite beautiful, its patterns resembling flowing streams and cascading waterfalls rendered in shades of blue and gray that seemed to move independently of the fabric itself. "What are you?" he asked, pressing his own hand against the glass opposite hers. "I am what happens when someone drowns alone," she replied. "When the water fills the lungs and the current carries the body away, but the soul remains trapped between the surface and the bottom, unable to rise or sink. I am the part that stays behind, waiting for others to help me find the rest." The girl's explanation carried a sadness that Pastor Williams had not noticed before, a loneliness that spoke of years or perhaps decades spent wandering between the worlds of the living and the dead. Her recruitment of others was not malicious predation, but desperate companionship seeking, the actions of someone who had been isolated for so long that any human contact seemed worth the price of another's life. "How long have you been alone?" Pastor Williams asked. The girl's expression grew distant, as if she were looking back through vast stretches of time. "I fell through the ice in the spring of 1847, she said. "The current carried me under before anyone could reach me, but my body was never found. My parents searched for weeks, dragging nets through every deep pool and checking every bend where debris collected. But I had gone too far down, into the places where the water connects to underground rivers and caves that have never seen sunlight." Pastor Williams felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. The girl had been dead for 17 years, wandering the waterways of the region and luring others to join her in whatever liminal existence she inhabited between life and death. Her victims were not random casualties but carefully chosen companions, selected for their vulnerability and their capacity to find comfort in the peace she offered. "Why children?" he asked. "Why do you target the young and innocent?" The girl's smile carried genuine warmth for the first time since Pastor Williams had encountered her. "Children understand better than adults," she said. "They have not yet learned to fear the water, have not yet built walls between themselves and the natural world. They can see the beauty in drowning, the freedom in letting go of breath and sinking into the embrace of something larger than themselves." The conversation was interrupted by shouting from the direction of the church. Pastor Williams turned away from the window to investigate the disturbance, and when he looked back, the girl had vanished. But her handprint remained on the glass, outlined in condensation that formed letters spelling out a single word: "Soon." The commotion at the church proved to be another disappearance. Young Sarah Mitchell, the blacksmith's daughter, had vanished from the family's cottage during the night. Her parents had discovered her absence at dawn when she failed to appear for breakfast, and their frantic search of the property had revealed no clues to her whereabouts. But the pattern was becoming depressingly familiar to the valley's residents, who gathered at the church to organize yet another search they expected to be futile. Pastor Williams found the search party already assembling when he arrived at the church, their faces bearing expressions of grim resignation rather than hope. Too many similar searches had ended with the discovery of bodies that defied medical explanation, victims who had drowned in impossible circumstances and been transformed by their encounter with the girl in the water-stained dress. "She's taken another one," Martha Caldwell said without preamble as Pastor Williams approached the group. "Sarah Mitchell, age 10, vanished sometime after midnight. Her bedroom window was found open and there are wet footprints leading from her bed to the sill." The footprints told a story that no one wanted to believe but could no longer deny. 2 sets of prints had been found, Sarah's small bare feet and the unmistakable marks of the drowned girl, both leading from the bedroom toward the creek. The prints showed no signs of struggle or coercion. They walked side by side like friends taking a stroll. But this time, the search yielded different results. Sarah Mitchell was found alive, though barely conscious, sitting waist-deep in a calm pool upstream from the mill. Her lips were blue with cold, and she showed signs of prolonged exposure to the freezing water, but she was breathing and responsive when the searchers pulled her from the creek. Sarah's account of her experience provided the first direct testimony about the girl's underwater realm, and the fate of those who accepted her invitation. According to the child, she had been visited by the girl during the night and convinced to follow her to the creek for what was described as a special kind of swimming lesson. "She showed me how to breathe underwater," Sarah told Dr. Morrison with the earnest conviction of a child reporting miraculous events. "You have to let the water come into your lungs slowly, and then it doesn't hurt anymore. It becomes like air, but heavier and warmer. And once you can breathe the water, you can see all the beautiful things that live at the bottom." Sarah described an underwater landscape populated by the spirits of everyone who had ever drowned in Harrow's Creek and its tributaries. Timothy Henderson was there, she claimed, along with Mrs. Abernathy and dozens of others stretching back through decades of valley history. They lived in houses built from river stones and decorated with treasures lost by surface dwellers, jewelry, coins, and personal belongings that had fallen into the water over the years. "They're all happy there," Sarah insisted. "No one gets sick or tired or sad in the underwater place. The girl takes care of everyone and they take care of each other, and the water keeps them safe from all the bad things that happen up here." Dr. Morrison's examination of Sarah revealed changes that supported at least some aspects of her fantastic account. The child's lungs showed signs of having been filled with water and then drained, but there was no damage from the experience. Her skin had developed a slight translucent quality, similar to that observed in previous victims, and her eyes reflected light with unusual intensity. Most disturbing was Sarah's apparent inability to fully return to normal breathing. She complained constantly of feeling suffocated by air and begged to be allowed to return to the creek so she could breathe properly again. When denied this request, she began holding her breath for extended periods and attempting to fill containers with water so she could submerge her face. "She's been changed," Dr. Morrison told Sarah's parents privately. "I don't understand the mechanism, but something has altered her physiology. She's becoming adapted to an aquatic environment, and I fear the changes may be irreversible." Pastor Williams understood that Sarah's partial transformation represented a new phase in the girl's campaign to claim the valley's residents. Rather than simply drowning her victims, she was now creating intermediaries who could testify to the benefits of joining her underwater community. Sarah's enthusiastic descriptions of life beneath the creek would be far more convincing to other children than any supernatural manifestation. The minister's fears were confirmed when several more children began reporting dreams about the underwater paradise that Sarah described. They spoke of visiting the drowned girl's realm during their sleep and meeting the spirits of deceased neighbors who assured them that death by drowning was not frightening but liberating. These dream visitations left the children with detailed knowledge about people and events they should have had no way of knowing, lending credibility to their accounts that their parents found deeply unsettling. Winter deepened into the coldest season anyone in the valley could remember, but the creek remained unfrozen despite temperatures that should have locked it in solid ice. Steam rose from the water's surface on the coldest nights, and residents reported seeing lights moving beneath the surface. Not the random flicker of moonlight on ripples, but deliberate illumination that suggested inhabited structures in the creek's depths. The girl in the water-stained dress became bolder as her influence over the community grew stronger. She appeared openly during daylight hours, walking along the creek bank and waving to children who watched from their windows. She attended church services, sitting in the back pew with water pooling around her feet while Pastor Williams struggled through sermons that seemed increasingly irrelevant to his congregation's supernatural predicament. "She's not hiding anymore," Martha Caldwell observed after one particularly difficult Sunday service. "She wants us to see her, wants us to get used to her presence. She's making herself part of our community, and some people are starting to accept that." Martha's observation was unfortunately accurate. A growing faction within the valley had begun to view the drowned girl not as a threat, but as an inevitable presence that should be accommodated rather than resisted. They pointed to Sarah Mitchell's transformation as evidence that the girl's influence was not necessarily fatal, and they argued that fighting against supernatural forces was futile and potentially dangerous. This acceptance faction was led by James Crawford, a pragmatic farmer who had lost his wife to consumption the previous year, and saw the girl's offer of reunion in death as preferable to continued separation in life. Crawford began holding meetings in his barn, where Valley residents could discuss their experiences with the drowned girl and consider the possibility that she represented an opportunity rather than a threat. Death comes to everyone eventually, Crawford argued during one of these gatherings. The girl is offering us a choice about how we die and what comes after. Instead of fearing disease and old age and all the suffering they bring, we can choose to join those who have gone before us in a place where pain and loss are impossible. Crawford's arguments gained support among those who had lost loved ones to the girl's influence, particularly parents who hoped to be reunited with children who had vanished into the creek. The promise of continued existence in an underwater paradise where families could be reunited and suffering eliminated appealed to people who had endured more than their share of hardship and loss. Pastor Williams found his authority as spiritual leader challenged by this growing acceptance of the supernatural alternative to traditional religious consolation. His sermons about heavenly reward and divine justice seemed abstract and uncertain compared to the tangible evidence of the girl's underwater realm, provided by witnesses like Sarah Mitchell. The crisis came to a head on Christmas Eve, when a blizzard struck the valley with unprecedented fury. The storm arrived without warning, transforming a clear winter evening into a whirling chaos of snow and wind that made travel between houses impossible. Families huddled around their fires and waited for the weather to pass. But as the hours wore on, it became apparent that this was no ordinary winter storm. The snow fell upward as often as down, swirling in patterns that defied wind direction and accumulating in shapes that resembled frozen waterfalls and ice fountains. Most disturbing was the sound that accompanied the storm, not the usual howling of wind, but a chorus of voices singing in harmony, their words inaudible, but their melody unmistakably sad and beautiful. Pastor Williams recognized the singing as the voices of everyone who had joined the girl in her underwater realm, their spirits somehow manifesting through the storm to call others to join them. The supernatural blizzard was not a weather event but a recruitment effort on a scale that dwarfed anything the girl had attempted previously. As the singing grew louder, residents throughout the valley began leaving their homes despite the dangerous conditions. They walked through the storm toward the creek as if following invisible guides, their faces bearing expressions of peaceful determination that suggested they were finally answering a long-awaited summons. Pastor Williams struggled through the storm toward his church, fighting against wind that seemed specifically designed to prevent his progress. When he finally reached the building, he found it filled with valley residents who had sought shelter from the supernatural tempest. But these were not random refugees. They were the people who had resisted the girl's influence most strongly, the ones who still viewed her as a threat rather than an opportunity. "She's calling everyone at once," Martha Caldwell gasped as Pastor Williams entered the church. "The storm isn't natural, Pastor. It's her voice made manifest, and it's pulling people toward the creek whether they want to go or not." Through the church windows, Pastor Williams could see figures moving through the blizzard toward the water. Some walked alone, while others moved in family groups, all of them following the same inexorable path toward whatever fate awaited them in the girl's domain. The storm had become a supernatural tide that was carrying away everything the valley's residents had built and believed in. Pastor Williams understood that this was the moment of final confrontation he had been dreading since his first encounter with the girl in the water-stained dress. He could remain in the church with the other resistors and watch as their community dissolved into the supernatural storm, or he could face the drowned girl directly and attempt to break whatever hold she had established over the valley. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable rather than heroic. Pastor Williams opened the church door and stepped into the blizzard, immediately feeling the pull of voices that promised rest and reunion and an end to all earthly struggles. The girl was waiting for him at the creek, standing on the surface of the water as if it were solid ground, her arms extended in welcome. "You have fought well, Pastor Williams," she said, her voice carrying clearly above the storm. "But you cannot save them from what they choose freely. I offer peace and they accept. I offer love, and they embrace it. You offer duty and sacrifice and the promise of rewards that may never come. Which of us truly serves their needs? Pastor Williams waded into the creek, feeling the water rise around his legs with shocking warmth despite the freezing air. The girl's presence surrounded him like a gentle current, and he understood for the first time why so many had chosen to follow her into the depths. "I offer hope," he said, though his words felt weak against the overwhelming peace that emanated from the girl's supernatural realm. "Hope is suffering," the girl replied. "Hope is the refusal to accept what is in favor of what might be. I offer certainty. I offer the end of waiting and wanting and fearing loss. In the water, there is only the eternal present moment, only the embrace of something larger than individual desire." Pastor Williams felt his resistance crumbling as the water rose to his waist. The girl's arguments contained a logic that his exhausted spirit found increasingly difficult to refute. The burdens of pastoral care, the constant exposure to human suffering, the weight of responsibility for souls he could not truly save, all of these pressures seemed meaningless compared to the peace that waited beneath the surface. But as the water reached his chest and the girl extended her hand for the final invitation, Pastor Williams heard something that changed everything: the sound of crying from the direction of the church. Someone was still inside, still fighting against the supernatural tide, still choosing hope despite everything that argued against it. The crying belonged to Susan Caldwell, Martha's daughter, who had hidden in the church rather than follow her mother toward the creek. The 8-year-old girl was calling for Pastor Williams, begging him not to leave her alone in a world where everyone else had chosen the peace of drowning over the struggle of living. The sound of Susan's tears cut through the girl's enchantment like a blade, reminding Pastor Williams that his duty was not to his own peace, but to those who still needed protection and guidance. He pulled his hand back from the girl's grasp and began wading toward shore, fighting against a current that had become supernaturally strong. "You cannot save her," the girl called after him. "You can only delay the inevitable. The water calls to everyone eventually, and she will answer when her time comes." Pastor Williams did not respond to the girl's prediction because he knew it was probably true. But his calling was not to prevent death, but to serve life for as long as it lasted, to offer hope and comfort and meaning, even in the face of inevitable loss. He reached the shore as the storm began to subside, the supernatural blizzard fading as the girl's massive recruitment effort concluded. Dawn revealed a valley transformed by the night's events. Houses stood empty, their doors open to reveal the absence of families who had answered the drowned girl's call. The creek ran higher than normal, as if swollen by more than snowmelt. Susan Caldwell was indeed alone in the church, the sole survivor of a community that had chosen peace over struggle. Pastor Williams gathered the child in his arms and carried her away from Harrow Valley, leaving behind the empty houses and the creek, where the girl in the water-stained dress continued her patient wait for the next souls who would seek the comfort of her underwater realm. Years later, when Susan had grown to adulthood and moved far from any running water, she would still dream of the drowned girl and wake with the taste of creek water in her mouth. And sometimes, on the clearest nights, she could swear she heard voices singing beneath the surface of every stream and river, calling her to come home to the deep places where the current carries away all pain and fear and loneliness. The girl in the water-stained dress remains in Harrow Valley still, waiting with the patience of geological time for the next community to settle along her creek and discover the peace that lies beneath the surface of flowing water. If this haunting tale of supernatural tragedy gave you chills, smash that like button and subscribe for more spine-chilling historical mysteries. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and whether you or anyone you know has ever felt an inexplicable pull toward water or experienced something supernatural near rivers or lakes. Your stories might just become our next terrifying video.